Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of She Talks Business. I have such a unique and interesting guest for you to learn from today, someone that is a dear friend and colleague of mine, and someone that I really look up to for his leadership skills and the way that he treats and interacts with people in addition to his expertise. So I would like to introduce you to Gene Moran. Gene is the trusted advisor to defense and security companies who want to engage, serve, and sell to the federal government. He helps these companies navigate the entire funding spectrum and successfully receive federal funding. His results measure in billions of dollars of upside federal sales, and his firm, Capital Integration, has been recognized multiple times by Bloomberg government as a top lobbying firm. He is an inductee in the $1 Million Consulting Hall of Fame, the only government relations professional to receive such recognition. He is recognized as a 2020 top lobbyist by the National Institute for Lobbying and Ethics, a consultant of the year with the 2020 Corey Shanahan Memorial Award for Advancing Consulting by the Society for Advancing Consulting. Before founding his government relations firm, which I think is super interesting, he spent a distinguished career as a U.S. Navy surface warfare officer, retiring as a captain, where he gained a detailed understanding of the defense industrial base and supply chains of myriad platforms, systems, and capabilities. He has now written 4 books: Pitching the Big Top, How to Master the Three-Ring Circus. I can't speak. Pitching the Big Top, How to Master the Three-Ring Circus of Federal Sales, Make Your Move, Charting Your Post-Military Career, and Capital Currency, which he also has a really fabulous online program that goes with that book. And most recently, he wrote a book with Alan Weiss, which I am very jealous over the title, $1 Million Influence: How to Drive Powerful Decisions Through Language, Leverage, and Leadership. Gene, welcome to the show.
Lisa, thank you for having me. What an intro. I'll need to edit that down a little bit, I think.
It's great, though. I love it because you have had such an interesting career and you have accomplished so much. And I love where your career took you and what you have accomplished in your consulting business, because I think you are just such a rare individual to have created such success in life and business.
Well, you're very kind. Thank you for saying that. I think in a lot of ways, it's a matter of just pushing on doors. And it is amazing how many doors have opened that I could not even see when I was on active duty and when I left active duty.
Well, I think it speaks to the title of your most recent book, $1 Million Influence. When you have the right relationship skills, you can influence outcomes, you can influence people, and you can influence door opening. So why don't we start with you just telling everyone a little bit about your work and your business and what you do, who you help?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I help companies who are trying to sell to the federal government, primarily in the defense industry. And I am probably most helpful to companies who have a limited Washington, D.C. presence, or maybe have no Washington, D.C. presence. And the Washington, D.C. presence is important because government contracting is really about following money. If something in Washington is not funded, it's not real. That's an old saw, but it's very, very true. And I have learned over time that many companies who are trying to sell to the federal government just don't understand the processes, and there are multiple processes that are interrelated. And I recognize that my exposure to those things was something that I could help teach others and help guide companies to better outcomes.
So you refer to the 3-ring circus in your work, and you also talk a lot about when you're not really selling to the federal government, you're trying to get funded, not sold. And so can you talk to us a little bit about what's different about selling to the federal government than selling to a corporation, for example?
Well, I don't have direct experience selling business to business in a commercial sense. My entire experience is focused on my exposure to the federal process.
Mhm.
And so drawing direct distinctions may be a bit challenging, but some commonalities that I see about companies who come from the commercial world into the federal space, they are all used to a much shorter sales timeline for the sale to mature,
Mhm.
and they're looking for relatively quick results. It's the world they come from, and the federal process just doesn't work like that. It takes 3 years to develop a budget. One needs to be in the budget in order to be funded for a contract, and sometimes it takes all 3 of those years to get through that process. I help companies identify where we can short circuit that process, and maybe it doesn't have to take that long. Sometimes it's about adjusting a policy that might be inhibiting funding. Sometimes it's about recognizing that technology is moving much faster than that budget process, and we need to alert key decision makers and champions that there's an opportunity here to get it right by skipping a few steps.
Mhm.
It's very approachable for any company, but most think that it's just a big elephant that they can't get their arms around. The metaphor of the three-ring circus refers to industry, agency, and Congress. Those are three key elements of any federal sale. And the circus metaphor is really meant to identify that there are many things in relative motion at once, not that it's a circus act sort of experience, but it's more a metaphor for relative motion. There are many things happening at once, and it's
Mhm.
difficult to see it all for what it is unless you're high enough up in the big tent.
So if it takes 3 years to essentially close business, then people who are selling to the federal government need to A, be patient, B, understand the process, and C, stick with the process long enough to get results. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Many companies are challenged. I say companies, many defense executives are challenged to see the potential outcome that an investment in this sort of effort might produce. And so they might give up too early. And it
Mhm.
could be that had they stuck around for a matter of months longer, they might have had a different result. But if you don't understand the process, you might make decisions that are just based on incomplete information or lack of information.
Mhm.
Executive awareness is an ongoing issue in that there aren't really schools one can attend to learn these processes. Specifically about Congress, there's no lobbying school. It's learned by doing or by experience in roles that involved lobbying, either as
Mhm.
a congressional staffer or executive, agency executive, that is. Um, but they are learnable skills, but in most cases it makes sense to hire that sort of support out because a
Mhm.
typical defense executive just will not come across the opportunities to learn it other than over time, and that's expensive tuition to pay.
Yeah. And if you don't understand the process, you probably could inadvertently spend even more time trying to make things happen without success.
What I see happening is that executives will move from one company to another, and so they might come out of active duty, go to a defense company, learn the process, but they might not be so successful because they were still learning the ropes.
Mhm.
They might leave, they might be asked to leave, they might go to another company where they now learn maybe a slightly different adaptation about how to participate in the process, and over time they do gain skills and they
Mhm.
learn. But as I said, it's an expensive way to learn.
Mhm. Talk to me a little bit about your career in the Navy and how has being in the Navy prepared you to be successful as an entrepreneur and business owner?
Well, I was as you mentioned, a surface warfare officer, which means I was on ships. I served
Mhm.
in 6 different ships. And in the Navy, they say you're at sea or in DC. And so my experience was that I rotated back and forth between sea duty and DC duty. And while I was ashore in DC, some of my jobs were supporting the budget process, the appropriations process, interacting with Congress, representing Congress at the very high levels of the Navy. So advising the Secretary of the Navy or Chief of Naval Operations on how legislative policy might unfold. Uh, I had a role where I ran the Navy Senate office, where I was resident on Capitol Hill and uh, led members of Congress on international travel,
Wow.
executing their agendas. But in that role, I got to see up close what concerns really are present for any member of Congress or senator, and they're all slightly different, but there's some commonalities.
Mhm.
But in my ship jobs, I rose to command 2 warships, and command at sea is a place where there is singular accountability at the top. So anything that happens on that ship, good or bad, falls to the captain. It
Mhm.
doesn't mean that the captain does everything, but there's a degree of accountability that comes with everything. And that learning to bear that weight is something that is developed over time. But as a result, I have a resiliency and an ability to live with ambiguity and be comfortable with ambiguity, recognizing that conditions are in place under which I have reasonable control, and I can identify when things are going right or wrong. And those
Mhm.
turn out to be some pretty important features of entrepreneurship when you can control your own destiny and recognize where you need to go in a general sense. You don't have to have an exact script, but I saw a lot of commonality in how I've borne the burden of entrepreneurship, such that it
Mhm.
is.
Mm. So you and I started to work together a few years ago when you initially reached out for marketing help. Can you, for our listeners, the purpose of this season is for people to hear from different types of business owners and hear some of the reasons why they decided they needed help in their business. So, do you remember why you reached out to me? What it was that was happening in your business at the time that made you realize that you needed someone else to assist you?
I think an evolution takes place. If I think back to my time on active duty, where I was in the Pentagon, we would see retired officers who were now working for defense companies walking the hallways. At the time, you could enter the Pentagon and walk the hallways. That has since been changed. But I knew at the time I never wanted to be a sales guy that was selling to the federal government. That just it didn't ring right to me, and it turned out to be pretty ignorant on my part to have that mindset. And I'm not alone in that thought. You can still see it today in senior members of the active duty military, where they think selling is not something positive.
Mhm.
Well, when I was in corporate, I did a corporate job for about 5 years after active duty. I recognized that business development is fundamentally what companies have to have in place in order to achieve sales and make those targets and be a sustaining company. That general exposure I took with me into uh, starting my own consultancy. But even in my first few years, I was sort of doing what I had seen others do in terms of being a consultant. And you can make a very comfortable living just hanging a shingle and doing what you know how to do.
Mhm.
But if you want to get really good and better known for what you do and how you do it, you need to be telling people about that, and people need to be talking about you. And I say you in sort of a generic sense. I came to learn through uh, my work with Alan Weiss and
Mhm.
his community that one needs to be in the public square. And that means writing, that means presenting, that means being a thought leader in some way, and identifying what it is that I'm able to talk about. And I recognized that I needed help with that, because whether it's websites or social media, or how to use automated features of email to spread the word or have some persistence in messaging, that takes professionals, or it takes time.
Mhm.
And in consulting, as a solo consultant, time is that non-renewable resource. And so, do I want to spend that time learning how to do social media, or learning how to build a website? Or it just didn't make sense to me. And the growth of the business could now sustain the incorporation of a marketing element that I knew was an investment, but I knew could help me continue to grow and sustain growth in a different way. I knew I couldn't do it alone.
So what I'm hearing you say is you have to know where you're going, and you have to be willing to invest to get there. Can you talk a little bit about how that works in your industry? When do people know they need you?
Some aren't quite sure what they need, but they recognize that they're not winning nearly enough,
Mhm.
and they're being outmaneuvered, but they don't necessarily know why. I came to see that I could help people when I saw in my corporate role. Let me back up a step. In my corporate role, I was working for a defense company that served a lot of different major platforms, which had connections to a lot of different companies. And periodically, those companies would come to town meaning DC, to help tell the collective story of why a particular platform is important to industry. I recognized in communicating with those company leaders that were coming from out of town that they really didn't understand what was happening here. And it was an eye opener for me, but it's where I saw my opening to perhaps, help other companies. I feel like I'm rambling around a little bit.
No, are there specific things? So you recognize the gap. How do they know there's a gap?
I think anybody who's successful in federal sales has to have a little bit of self-reflection about what they're doing and what they understand. And those that are more open to acknowledging that they don't know it all begin to search for help. The problem, as I see it within the defense industry, is that the networks upon which people are drawing are too narrow. So they speak to people who went before them, who might have been their leaders on active duty and are now in the defense industry. And they may have what I would refer to as a geographically diverse network, but they don't have a truly diverse network of people that have different skills that can be applied. And so, the reality for me is that my business is 100% referral based. So somebody has to tell somebody about me. So somebody has to be experiencing success to feel like they want to refer me. When that happens, somebody may look online, as we typically would do, and start to see what is it about this person? Is there something here? And now if somebody looks for me online, they'll see, I think, a substantial body of work that quite honestly, I did not envision when I left active duty. I didn't envision it when I started out as a solo practitioner, but I recognized that developing that body of work was critical to people understanding who I am. And when you can put thought-provoking things in the public square through various channels, it can help other people understand what it is that they may be missing. So I'm not giving you a simple answer to the question, because many people don't recognize it until you put it right in front of them, that, oh, that's what I need. Or they get a referral that says, hey, you need to talk to Gene. And then it goes from there.
Or they read Masterful Marketing, and there's a whole chapter on people know what they want, not what they need.
Absolutely.
Yes. I think that, as I think about this, one of the things that you said is people reach out to ask for help because they're not winning enough. And so when you are in business, regardless of the type of business you have, if you're trying harder and what you're trying isn't getting you the results that you want, chances are what you're trying isn't an effective way to get the result. And so when you engage in a consultant, a coach, an advisor to help you, you get that outside perspective that can show you what you're doing wrong. Like I'm reminded of, the story of the fly in the window trying to get through the window, and a fly, he keeps beating his head up against the glass and he's eventually going to die. But meanwhile, 3 feet over, there's an open door that he could have flown out. But the fly doesn't look around. The fly doesn't ask for help. The fly just keeps beating his head against the window until he eventually dies. And I think that, in business, you have to be aware of when you're acting like a fly and stop beating your head against the wall and get somebody, or the window, you get somebody to help you.
To that point of self-reflection, some people just can't see it in themselves. And it's crazy to me that defense executives will travel the country or even the globe to attend trade shows and hope for a chance meeting with somebody. And they're spending a lot to do that. And it's not that you don't need to do some of that, but there's an and the and is you need professional support. I'm not here marketing my services. I recognize what the podcast is about, and this is about business, but sometimes that buyer doesn't recognize what exactly it is that they need, and until you put it in front of them, they might not change their behavior.
Mm-hmm. I find it interesting that we have similar parallels in terms of the length of our engagements, because when people retain your services, they typically work with you for 3 years
or more.
Yeah.
And those that don't work that long, it's most often because the government didn't like what they had. And so sometimes people will come forward and they'll say, I have this great thing and I've sold it over here, and the Army bought it or the Air Force bought it, and I know the Navy would buy it. And it turns out, well, maybe those sales in the other agencies weren't exactly as described. Maybe the technology didn't perform exactly as described, or they're just too new to the opportunity and aren't ready for it. But this is a retainer sort of arrangement that does lend itself to committing to objectives that take a little time, and so we're not tracking hours, we're not tracking a specific set of checklist items that we're working down, and we're reacting to an environment that's unfolding, a legislative environment and an economic environment.
Yeah, I think it's important, though, for people to consider that regardless of the business or industry you're in, for you to get transformational outcomes, you typically need to invest for more than just a year. So I know there are people listening to this podcast who are probably thinking about, their next move, and we've got a new year coming up. It's often a time where people are thinking about who they want to work with that can help them. And I would encourage you, as you're listening, to ask yourself if you've gotten the longevity that you need out of the work that you've done with someone else. Are you giving up too soon? I'm also curious, Gene, the work that you do is not considered B2B in the traditional sense. And so how did you find the resources that you needed to help this kind of unicorn style business you have? How did you find, Alan and his community and all of that?
When I left corporate, I was undecided if I wanted to join a group or work independently. And in Washington, D.C., there are many partnerships, there are many groups that work together, and it's fairly easy to link up with them. And the idea is that they present themselves as able to then serve this broad base of clientele because they can cover every specialty. And, the reality of that sort of alignment is that it means for the client that on any given day, you don't necessarily know who's in charge of your program or your issue. But I recognized that I probably was a better fit to work alone. That command sort of mentality of being accountable appeals to me. I like being in control. But through absolute luck, somebody handed me a book and said, "You ought to take a look at this book." And it was about getting started in consulting by Alan Weiss. It was one of his very early books. And I distinctly remember being up at 2:00 in the morning devouring this book, because I recognized that after having been a senior vice president in a large defense company, I did not have a clue as to how I had been hiring consultants. And those consultants on the other side that I was hiring had no clue about how they were presenting themselves to me. And it was just incredibly eye-opening to realize that I did not understand consulting the way it really could be done. And what I had witnessed was people just hanging a shingle and having success and trying to make up that difference of active duty pay versus retired pay. And they weren't thinking big enough. There was no imagination involved. And that sort of started my recognition that Alan Weiss was onto something. Sadly, it took me a couple of years to recognize that I really need to get active in his programs. And it wasn't until I went to a live event that I really had the awakening that what had been missing in my corporate role was the investment and growth that was occurring on active duty throughout my career. You're continually learning and training and growing into new roles. And that wasn't happening in corporate, but I needed to make it happen in consulting. There she is.
We have dogs.
But I needed to make that happen for myself as a consultant. And I've, as a result, have invested significantly in development, self-development. And I would encourage anybody who's in business for themselves needs to set some portion aside as required investment. So I'm 60 years old and I'm still learning, and I see a lot of runtime left.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I agree that reading a book is not enough. I think that those in-person events really make a difference for people because they get to experience you live in person. And I know for myself, I've garnered a lot of business, not only by hosting my own events, but attending events, because when people meet you in person, they can feel your energy, they can feel your personality, they can feel your intentions. And as hard as you try through a Zoom screen, it's not quite the same as when you are in person with somebody.
So to relate that to marketing versus sales, it came to mind as we were talking about this. Many people, I think, are mistaking marketing for a sales lever. And I think marketing has a lot to do with sales, but it has more to do with about how people are evaluating you prior to the sale. Yeah. And that's another investment in oneself. So I feel like the marketing that I do is investing in myself and my company, that I may not see a direct linear connection to sales, but over time, sales improve and the quality of the sale improves, the type of companies that come to me changes, and I see fairly substantial outcomes. But if I weren't able to make that investment, or I didn't want to make that investment, I would effectively be holding myself back.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. I think that a lot of times marketing is a credibility piece. So if you are in an industry where you get a lot of word of mouth referrals, you know that before that referral is going to make contact, they're going to check you out in some way. And typically that means they're going to Google you. They're going to go to your website. They're going to check out your LinkedIn profile, and they're going to get a sense of whether or not they think you're the right fit for them. I equate your website brand presence as being your storefront on the largest shopping center in the world. When you go to a shopping mall and there's 300 stores inside of that shopping mall, you never walk into all 300 stores. You walk down the hallway and you look at the storefronts and you pick and choose which ones you think will be right for you. And your website does that. Your website allows someone to make that snap judgment in terms of whether or not your product, your service, your value proposition is right for them. So I would agree, Gene. I think, marketing is the act of getting you in front of people and keeping you alive in that public square. But I also think it's a credibility piece that is really, really important.
When I work in a lane that might be identified as somewhat toxic by the uninformed. When you think about Washington D.C. or politics, we're in a period where there's just extreme left and right ideological discussions. I'm in an area where I have to focus on a higher level, and I use the national security architecture or hierarchy as the way to view what I do. We're providing things for the government, ultimately for the warfighter, and that doesn't have political ideology associated with it. So while I work with Congress, I'm not caught up in the far right, far left. I'm down the middle, and I have to work with whoever's in power to help companies. So if you were to look at my online presence that you have helped considerably with, it is a fairly neutral tone in terms of I think people would be challenged to identify me with a political party, and that's with purpose. But I'm trying to present information that is process oriented, that can help people understand that there's something here beyond the left right discussion that is perpetual and evergreen, and will help any company who's selling to the federal government go further if they can allow themselves to peel back the curtain a little bit.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Gene, thank you so much. I always enjoy our conversations because you're such a smart guy, and I feel like I learn something new every time I talk to you. So thank you for saying yes to being on She Talks Business. I recognize that most of the listeners of this show are not going to be your ideal buyer, but I am also confident that they will take away lots of value from the things that you have shared today. Just to recap, you got to think bigger. You need to know when you need help. You need to figure out how to translate some of the things that you did from your original professional career into your business. You need to get out to in-person events and interact with people. And you really need to understand the process in whatever game you're playing if you expect to win. So thank you very much for joining us. It was
Always
great to have you.
talk to you. Always great to talk to you. For those that don't know, I do spend a lot of quality time with Lisa in a number of programs. Your programs specifically, learning about things that I sometimes didn't know that I needed to know, and sometimes it's about things that I thought I knew about, but it turns out I needed to learn more. So that continual growing, it occurs in part because of you.
Thank you, Gene. I appreciate you saying that.
You bet.
All right, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you, or you will hear us again next week. Thanks for listening to She Talks Business.